The day they bulldozed my great-grandfather's bridge was the day I decided to turn their $4 million lakeside dream into a muddy graveyard. And looking back at it now, sipping my coffee on the porch while the sun hits the water just right, I realize that some people don and oppos. Just pick a fight with a man, they pick a fight with history. It all started at 6 in the morning on a Tuesday, the kind of morning where the mist is so thick you can't see where the dock ends and the lake begins. But the sound of those diesel engines, that's a sound you feel in your teeth. And when I looked out through the haze and saw that yellow bulldozer crawling toward the stone arch my great-grandfather, Elias Vance, built with his own two hands back in 1924, something inside me just snapped. That bridge wasn't just limestone and mortar, it was the soul of the Vance family. Built by a man who survived the trenches of World War I only to come home and carve a legacy out of the Texas Hill Country, connecting our isolated cabin to the world. And yet, to a woman like Brenda Sterling, it was just non-compliant masonry eyesore, that ruined the view of her new infinity pool. You see, Brenda is the president of the Blackwood Cove Homeowners Association, the kind of woman who treats a suburban cul-de-sac like a sovereign nation and carries a clipboard like a scepter. And when she moved in 3 years ago to head the development of the Grand Blackwood Resort and Amp Villas, she decided my family's property was a blemish on her high-end masterpiece. I remember the first time she ever stepped foot on my grass, her expensive heels sinking into the mud and her face twisted in this mask of pity as she told me that, progress requires sacrifice, Mr. Vance, as if she was doing me a favor by suggesting I tear down a century of history to make room for a golf cart path. I told her to get off my land. And I said it with the kind of directness that only a man who spent 20 years as a structural engineer can muster. But Brenda didn't get to where she is by taking, no, for an answer. And for months, she'd been burying me in certified letters, citing HOA bylaws that didn't and oppos. Even applied to me since my property was grandfathered in decades before her developer even bought the first acre of land. But Brenda had a board of directors full of newcomers who had more money than sense, people who bought into the dream of an, exclusive managed lifestyle, and viewed my beat-up Ford F-150 and my weathered cedar cabin as a threat to their property values. And so, they did it. They waited until I was supposed to be in the city for a site inspection, and they brought in the heavy machinery. I wasn't in oppos, in the city, though, because a gut feeling told me to stay home. And as I ran down to the bank of the creek, screaming for them to stop, I saw Brenda standing there in a white pantsuit, looking like she was presiding over a coronation, and she just pointed at the bridge and said, "It's for the good of the community, Elias. You'll thank me when your equity doubles." I watched the first block fall, the hand-carved limestone my great-grandfather had hauled from the quarry. And in that moment, the anger wasn't oppos. Hot. It was cold, a deep, freezing realization that if they wanted to play by the rules of power and leverage, I was going to show them exactly what an engineer with a grudge and a century-old deed could do. What Brenda and her fancy lawyers didn't in oppos, realize, or maybe they just didn't in oppos, care to check, was that back in 1920s, the Vance family didn't in oppos. Just owned the land, they owned the water, and when the county dammed the valley to create what is now Blackwood Lake, Elias Vance negotiated a deal that would make a modern-day lobbyist weep with envy. I spent the next 48 hours in the basement of the county records office, breathing in the scent of dust and rot, digging through maps that looked like they were drawn on parchment, until I found it. The, Flowage and Management Easement of 1926, a document that clearly stated the Vance estate held secondary management rights over the spillway gates to protect the, structural integrity of the Vance crossing, Basically, as long as that bridge stood, the county managed the water, but if the bridge was, compromised or removed, the management rights reverted back to the landowner to prevent flooding on the upstream side. And since Brenda had just, removed, the bridge, she had unwittingly handed me the keys to the entire lake. I didn't oppose, say a word to her for a week, let her think she'd won, let her go on the local news and talk about the, exciting expansion of the Blackwood Resort, and how the, clearing of old debris, was the first step toward their grand opening. while I was busy assembling my team, starting with my old mentor, a retired hydrologist named Silas, who knew the plumbing of this county better than he knew his own kids. Silas looked at the documents, whistled low, and told me, and quote, "Elias, if you turn those secondary gates, you aren't and oppos. T just moving water, you and oppos. Removing money. Millions of it, end quote." And I just nodded, thinking about the $4 million construction loan Brenda had taken out, a loan that I knew had a, end quote, minimum debt covenant, end quote, to ensure the resort and oppos. S massive floating restaurant and marina didn't and oppos. T end up sitting in swamp. The HOA started sending their, end quote, compliance officers, end quote, to my house twice a day, guys in polo shirts who looked like they failed out of the police academy, citing me for, end quote, unauthorized debris, end quote, on my own land, the debris being the remains of my bridge that they left in a heap, and they even had the nerve to fine me $500 a day for a, end quote, non-compliant mailbox, end quote, because it was the wrong shade of forest green. I remember one afternoon, Brenda's husband, Marcus, pulled up in his Tesla, rolled down the window, and told me I should just sell and move to the city before the, end quote, legal fees eat me alive, end quote. And I just smiled at him, a real slow, genuine smile, and said, end quote, "Marcus, you ever notice how quiet the lake gets right before a storm?" End quote. He just laughed and drove off, thinking I was just another broken old man clinging to the past, not realizing that I was currently looking at a weather forecast that predicted a 10-day dry spell. The perfect window for some, end quote, authorized maintenance, end quote, of the spillway. Friday morning, the day of the resort's, end quote, Golden Gala preview, end quote. I walked down to the spillway control box, which sat on a small parcel of land that had been in my family for 100 years, and I opened the heavy iron door that had an oppos. T-been touched since the drought of and oppos, 88. The mechanism was rusted, stubborn, and it groaned like a dying beast, but I'd spent the night before greasing the gears, and with one final heave, the secondary bypass gates began to whine, and then the sound of the water changed. It went from a gentle lap to a roar, a deep, guttural thrumming that shook the ground under my boots as thousands of gallons of water began to bypass the main dam and head straight into the lower creek. It was a controlled release, perfectly legal under my, end quote, management easement, end quote, for the purpose of, end quote, scouring the upstream silt beds following structural loss, end quote. And according to my calculations, it would take exactly 12 hours for the resort's $1.5 million marina to feel the sting. By 3 in the afternoon, the calls started coming in, and by 4, I could hear the sirens, and as I sat on my porch with a glass of bourbon, watching the water line recede like a slow-motion disaster movie, Brenda's white BMW came screaming up my dirt driveway, throwing gravel everywhere. She practically fell out of the car, her face a blotchy mess of rage and panic, screaming that the marina docks were tilting, that the floating restaurant was grounding out on a sandbar, and that the investors were losing their minds. And I just sat there, rocking in my chair, and said, and quote, "Progress requires sacrifice. Brenda, I sent into oppos. T that what you said?" End quote. She threatened to have me arrested. She threatened to sue me into the next century. She called the sheriff, the DNR, and the governor's office, but when the authorities arrived, I simply handed them the 1926 easement and my engineering log, which documented the, end quote, emergency silt management, end quote, necessitated by the illegal destruction of a historical crossing. The sheriff, a man who'd grown up in this town and whose father had fished off my bridge when he was a boy, looked at the papers, looked at the receding lake, and then looked at Brenda with a look that was pure, distilled satisfaction. And he told her, end quote, "It's a civil matter, Brenda, and from where I'm standing, Mr. Vance is just doing his job as a water manager." End quote. By sunset, the resort's $4 million investment was a literal mud pit. The floating restaurant was listing at a 45-degree angle with $50,000 worth of crystal glassware smashing onto the floor, and the, end quote, Grand Blackwood Resort, end quote, looked more like a, end quote, Grand Blackwood Swamp. End quote. The bank called their loan that night because the, end quote, minimum debt covenant, end quote, had been breached for more than 6 hours, and the investors, sensing a sinking ship, quite literally, started pulling out before the gala even started. The fallout was beautiful in its totality because it wasn't into Oppos. Just about the water, it was about the exposure of the rod at the heart of Brenda's operation. And as the lake level stayed low, the receding waters revealed things that Brenda had been hiding, like the fact that the resort's sewage overflow pipes were illegally diverted into the lake, and that the luxury pool house was built 10 feet over the property line on his state-protected wetlands. My lawyer, a shark of a man named Miller who lived for property rights cases, filed a $2 million suit for the destruction of the bridge, the emotional distress of the family legacy, and the environmental damage caused by the HOA's construction runoff. And for the first time in her life, Brenda Sterling didn't end Oppos. Have a clipboard to hide behind. She tried to fight it for a while. She tried to get the board to vote for an assessment to pay for her legal fees. But the neighbors, the same ones who had ignored me for a year, suddenly realized that their property values weren't into Oppos. Just dropping. They were cratering because of her incompetence. And the great HOA coup of Blackwood, happened in a church basement on a rainy Tuesday night. They voted her out. They voted her husband out. And they even voted to dissolve the architectural committee that had been harassing everyone about their mailbox colors. And within a month, Brenda's, spotless white BMW, was seen packed to the roof with her designer luggage as she slinked out of town under the cover of darkness to avoid the process servers who were waiting at her front door. The new HOA board, led by a local guy who actually knew how to bait a hook, came to me with a white flag, and we sat down like adults, and we made a deal. I closed the spillway gates and let the lake refill, but on my terms that included a permanent historic easement for my property, the full restoration of the Vance Bridge using the original limestone blocks, and a $250,000 contribution to the local conservation fund in the name of Elias Vance. It took 6 months to rebuild that bridge, and this time I oversaw every single stone that was laid, making sure the mortar was thick and the arch was true, and when the final keystone was dropped into place, I didn't in Oppos. Feel a sense of triumph so much as a sense of peace, a feeling that the debt had been paid and the land was back in balance. Today, the resort is under new management, a smaller, quieter operation that actually respects the local ecosystem and doesn't in Oppos. Mind that my truck is a little rusty, and the lake is full again, shimmering under the Texas sky. But people around here tell the story of, the Great Drain, whenever a new developer tries to get too greedy with the local zoning. My bridge stands there, a solid, limestone reminder that you can bulldoze a structure, but you can't bulldoze the rights that come with the soil, and every time I walk across it, I can almost hear my great-grandfather's voice in the wind, telling me that water always finds its level and justice always finds its way home. But it makes you wonder, doesn't it, Oppos? In a world where everyone is so obsessed with, progress, and, equity, and, managed lifestyles, and, how much of our own history are we willing to let them pave over before we decide to pull the plug? I see these developments popping up everywhere. These little private kingdoms run by people who think a set of bylaws is more powerful than a century of tradition. And I have to ask, if someone came for your legacy today, if they tried to erase the things your family built with their blood and sweat, would you have the guts to open the gates, or would you just sit back and watch the concrete dry? I've had people tell me I was cruel, that I cost innocent employees their jobs for a few months, and that I was, petty, for draining a whole resort over one bridge. But then I ask them, is it petty to defend your home, or is it petty to destroy a piece of history because it doesn't end Oppos? Match your white pantsuit? The comments on the local forums are still split, with half the town calling me a hero and the other half calling me a, property terrorist, And honestly, I'm fine with both because at the end of the day, my bridge is back, the water is mine, and Brenda Sterling is just a bad memory in a town that finally learned to value its roots. So, what do you think? Was I justified in taking the nuclear option to save my family's soul? Or did I go too far by dragging the whole community into my personal war with the HOA? I want to hear your horror stories. I want to know if you've ever had a fight, Brenda, in your own neighborhood and how you handled it. Because from where I'm sitting, the only way to stop a bully is to show them that you're the one holding the keys to the dam. And I'm curious to see how many of you would be willing to turn the wheel.